Hi everyone, welcome to the 7th lecture of Data Mining and Machine Learning. So we are now in week 4 and this entire week is dedicated to neural networks, and this will be the first lecture on neural networks today. So where are we? We are in week 4 dedicated to neural networks. And neural networks are powerful machine learning models, and they are motivated from biological neural networks, so the brain, so to speak. And while we don't know much about the brain, we do know that it's essentially a network of simple computational units, so neurons. So neurons are simple cells, and each of them do actually something simple, so a simple computation. But if you combine it into a big network, so into a brain, then you get something very complicated out of it. And a similar principle is used in artificial neural networks. So like biological neural networks, artificial neural networks are networks of simple functions. But we'll use mathematical functions and combine them into a network or a computational graph. And by doing so, we will be able to express very high-dimensional and very complicated functions. So under the hood, an artificial neural network will turn out to be a function approximator and actually a universal function approximator. So in principle, an artificial neural network can approximate any function you like arbitrarily well. And then we'll discuss a standard architecture of neural networks, the so-called multilayer perceptrons, which is generated by generating layers of these neurons, of these computational units, and essentially packing layers on top of each other. And And finally, we'll discuss learning via gradient descent, and we'll use a natural learning algorithm called backpropagation of error, or short backprop, to compute the gradient. And before we get started, I would like to ask you to watch this brief appetizer video, roughly 4 minutes, which essentially gives you a bit of the history of artificial neural networks and tunes you into the topic. And if you have the bandwidth, I really would recommend to watch this tutorial by 3 Blue, 1 Brown. So this is generally a channel which nicely illustrates deep mathematical topics with really nice animations and very well explained. So this is up. So together these are 4 videos, and together 1 hour, which is lengthy. So this is optional, but if you have the bandwidth, I really would recommend to watch this playlist. So this is the content for today. So we'll introduce neural networks and we'll compare them to their biological counterpart, and this will be a lightweight introduction and high-level view of neural networks. Then we'll introduce the basic principle of neural networks. So we will give basic definitions and give the basic definitions and the basic principle of neural networks as a network of artificial neurons. Then in the third section, we will discuss a standard structure, the multi-layer perceptron. And in the fourth lecture, we'll discuss learning via gradient descent using backpropagation of error. Okay, let's get started with our high-level view of neural networks. So in this section, we will give the motivation of artificial neural networks, namely from biological neural networks, so neural systems and the brain. And we'll compare artificial and biological neural networks, and then I will also give a brief history of artificial neural networks. So where do artificial neural networks, or ANNs, come from? Well, the idea is let's copy nature, let's copy the brain. So the brain is still the only truly intelligent device on Earth, so be it animal brains or human brains. And the idea is let's copy this system to come up with some artificial machine learning system which essentially copies these mechanisms, which hopefully will deliver something smart. This is a two-way street, however. So like on the one hand, we want to learn from biology and mimic this intelligent design. On the other hand, we are using artificial neural networks to understand biology better. So there is research on developing biologically accurate neural models, and artificial neural networks are used in simulation for biological neural networks, in particular spiking ANNs. So these biological neural networks, they have spiking behavior, so neurons communicate via electrical spikes here, and these spiking ANNs essentially try to mimic this. So the machine learning models, they typically don't use spiking aunts, but continuous approximation of this. And in a nutshell, so artificial neural networks are essentially powerful high-dimensional function approximators. So essentially the goal here is to fit a function which solves your engineering problem. So here is a comparison of biological and artificial neurons. So a real biological neuron has several parts. So it has a soma, this is the cell body, and so the soma gets input via these dendrites, and essentially there are previous neurons which send maybe at some point a spike, an electrical spike, and the spike travels to these dendrites and gets accumulated in the soma. And if this neuron gets excited enough, then it spikes itself. So it sends a spike as output, and the spike travels via this axon, which is essentially a long-way transmission to the next neurons. And then the spike gets transmitted via so-called synapses to the next neurons. And the synapses can have a strong or a weak connection weight, and a lot of the learning essentially happens by adapting these connection weights. And in artificial neural networks or in artificial neurons, this behavior is mimicked in a very coarse way. So instead of a soma, we have simply a summation function. And instead of spikes, we just send in real numbers. So continuous relaxation, essentially. So the weighting here essentially corresponds to the synapses. So synapses have adaptable weight. And so while they are drawn here on the right-hand side, the weighting here happens directly at the input. And so like the synapses, we have these adaptable weights, and these will be the parameters we are trying to learn. So we get here input. The input gets weighted with these adaptable weights and then just accumulated in a summation function. And so this neuron up here, the real neuron, the biological neuron, has this spiking behavior, which is highly nonlinear. So up to here, everything is just linear. And so this nonlinearity, this nonlinear behavior is simulated with a so-called activation function, which is, a nonlinear function we will talk more about later. And so the output of this neuron is then serves as input to consecutive neurons later. So this is a very coarse and continuous approximation of real biological neurons, and so this has to. We actually don't really know. We still don't know much about the brain, and also even how single neurons really work. So this must be taken with a grain of salt, and it's a very coarse approximation of what's really going on in biology. So artificial neural networks in a nutshell. So the concept is essentially modularity. So we have a lot of these neurons, and so neurons get inputs and produce a nonlinear output, and this output is then sent to other neurons and so on. So we built these networks by combining simple neurons or simple modules, and essentially we built high-dimensional complex functions from simple modules, essentially a little bit like Lego. And the main power of artificial neural networks is that they are function approximators, so powerful function approximators. So actually any engineering problem can be formulated as a function approximation problem, and so artificial neural networks are used to approximate these functions. So for example, a classification problem, predict apple or pear from an image. This is actually just a high-dimensional, highly nonlinear function, and we are using a neural network to approximate this function. And in fact, as we will discuss later, neural networks are so-called universal approximators. So in principle, you can approximate any desired function which pops up in engineering. Neural networks have a natural learning algorithm, which we will discuss later, namely backpropagation by error, which is actually just the chain rule of calculus. The major downside of neural networks is that they are black boxes. And essentially this is the same downside as we have in biological neural networks. So if we see a brain, we actually don't know what this brain really does by just looking at the brain. So brains and also artificial neural networks are hardly interpretable. Currently, neural networks are the most prominent machine learning tool, so in the context of deep learning. So you've probably heard about deep learning. Deep learning is actually just a new name for artificial neural networks. So essentially they are a resurrection of artificial neural networks. There are a few new gimmicks, however. So the main philosophy in deep learning is representational or end-to-end learning. So classical machine learning used to extract first features and then learn a classifier on top of that. And here the idea is to just provide the raw data to the whole system, and that the artificial neural network shall both learn the features and the classifier. But we'll discuss more about this in the next lesson when we discuss convolutional neural networks. We also have now bigger data sets and stronger computers, in particular GPUs, so we can now train bigger models. And there have been many algorithmic innovations or tricks of the trade. So artificial neural networks and deep learning can work like a charm, but often it's hard to really get the right setting. And so there are lots of training tricks which needs to be tried out. So here's a brief history of artificial neural networks. So neural networks go back to the 1940s. So McCulloch and Pitts came up with simple electrical circuits, which were early versions of artificial neural networks. Donald Hebb with Hebbian learning, which is a biological motivated learning rule. The famous paper by Frank Rosenblatt, the perceptron, which was actually able to solve some pattern recognition tasks. So in the 70s and 80s, there was actually little happening in AI and machine learning, since in this first AI phase, expectations were high, but they couldn't really live up to these expectations. Like there was quite a bit of disappointment concerning AI, and this was this famous AI winter. So in 82, John Hopfield proposed Hopfield networks, which are also biologically motivated artificial neural networks and an associative memory. In 86, there was this famous paper by Rummelhardt et al., who proposed the backpropagation algorithm. So the standard algorithm nowadays to learn neural networks. 89, proposal of convolutional neural networks by Jan LeCun, and they are the model nowadays the prediction model for images. 97, long short-term memory networks, so a type of recurrent neural network which is suited for sequence data, so like natural language. Then there was quite some decline in neural networks, and in this time, so in the 90s and early 2000s, this was more the time of the kernel, support vector machines and kernel. So this was really prominent back then. In 2006, neural networks they had kind of a comeback due to the paper by Hinton et al. So where they proposed deep belief networks, so a way to train the deep neural networks. In 2012, there was a famous paper which set new state of the art in image recognition on the famous image benchmark ImageNet. And after that, so in the last decade, we saw an extremely fast growth of deep neural networks and a lot of interest and many success stories since they are able to solve a lot of real-world problems. So this was a brief history of artificial neural networks. So where do artificial neural networks really shine? So essentially, neural networks are really good on sequence, signal-like data, so images, video, speech and audio, natural language, and so. And the main trick is actually that for each of these data domain, the particular structure and the particular type of the network is adapted. And this often happens over many trial and error, research lab experiment with different structures until something works. So there are now different types of artificial neural networks, multi-layer perceptrons, which we will discuss today, and they are essentially useful for any kind of data or unstructured data. Convolutional neural networks, which we will discuss in the next lesson, which are in particular suited for image data. Recurrent neural networks, in particular long short-term memories, LSTMs for sequence data like language, and transformer networks, which are essentially a more modern version of LSTMs. And so here neural networks really shine on this structured kind of data. On tabular unstructured data, however, so like where you would use a multi-layer perceptron, often other classifiers are actually better, so like random forests and support vector machines. And this already concludes this section. So we said, well, artificial neural networks are motivated from biology, and there's actually a two-way street. So we want, on the one hand, we want to learn from biology and improve machine learning. On the other hand, we want to use these artificial neural networks to do computational neuroscience. So we want to understand biological neural networks better by simulating them. Well, the main idea of artificial neural networks is this modularity. So we build high-dimensional complicated functions via simple networks or networks of simple units or neurons. They are powerful function approximators. Major downside is the black boxes. We'll learn about the conceptual simple learning rule, backprop, which is actually just the chain rule of calculus. And neural networks are currently the mainstream in machine learning.